I'll just move on to just saying we're delighted to welcome Dr. Steve Kirkwood here. Steve is Head of Social Work and a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy at the University of Edinburgh. Originally from Aotearoa, otherwise known as New Zealand, Steve has been undertaking research on a range of justice-related interventions and policy topics in Scotland since 2005. He's been with the University of Edinburgh since completing his PhD in 2012, and his main areas of research interest are justice social work, restorative justice, and the integration of refugees. He's co-led on a number of key investigative projects in the area of restorative justice, or RJ, and most recently in August of this year, he published a history of RJ in Scotland. And as I say, the link to that will be sent out with the recording from today's webinar. So without further ado, Steve, a very warm welcome to CYCJ and to Restorative Justice Week. It's great to have you here, and I'll hand over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Lauren and Pamela, for the invite to speak today. I really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for coming along. Lauren, also well done on attempting to pronounce Aotearoa, the Indigenous name of New Zealand. So well done. I'm going to start sharing my slides. Just give me one moment. So thanks again. What I'm going to do today is just really present some work from a publication that I published in 2022, outlining a practice framework for restorative justice. And as Lauren mentioned, you can read the article if you want further info. So I'll just kind of go through and explain what really I'm talking about here. Essentially, the practice framework, the idea of it is to try and take the values and see how they drive right through any particular intervention, but in this case specifically restorative justice. So really this is influenced by Tony Ward and Russell Durant's work, where they were looking at practice frameworks in correctional contexts, criminal justice and so on. And so as you can see by this diagram, the idea is that rather than say values just being like an add-on to particular interventions, they're actually inherently connected to the way that they operate. So they talk about these kind of three levels, one being core values and principles, another one being knowledge-related assumptions. So what are some of the assumptions we make, or kind of like underpinning ways of thinking about, let's say, criminal harm and responses to it? And then how does this connect with actually doing particular interventions? And so one of the things I did here was reviewed a wide range of international guidelines on restorative justice to try and distill, well, what are some of the key values and assumptions here, and how can we then think about this as an integrated whole to guide practice? So as a kind of a touchstone for principles of restorative justice, Howard Zehr and Mika have written about these, and I think these put us in good stead in terms of thinking fundamentally, what do we mean by restorative justice? What's it about in terms of principles? And a fundamental principle from the perspective of restorative justice is that crime is fundamentally a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. So, and one of the ways that this could be contrasted is, of course, with the kind of standard criminal justice response, which sees crime as a violation of rules and as being against the state. Whereas in this perspective, it's really about understanding how when people commit criminal harm, they harm each other and the relationships between people. A related principle is that violations create obligations and liabilities, so that if someone commits harm, that there is an obligation in there to do something in response to try and, say, set things right or take responsibility for the harm caused. Again, although there are parallels with how this tends to be treated in a kind of standard criminal justice context, some of the differences are that say criminal courts might be thinking more about holding people to account and imposing punishment, as opposed to, for example, creating opportunities for people to take responsibility, take some responsibility for those obligations. And then this is connected to the third principle, that restorative justice seeks to heal and put right the wrongs. So if you think about the connection between those, if criminal harm is about harm to people and relationships, then this creates obligations for people to set things right. Then restorative justice comes in as basically a type of process where you're looking to facilitate opportunities for people to take responsibility and to do things to try and set things right. So, in terms of ethical values in restorative justice, these do get talked about in quite a wide range of ways. So, they can be quite variable when looking at actually, how restorative justice is done in different contexts and different services and so on. But there are several that seem to be core. One of the most fundamental ones is about voluntariness, the idea that restorative justice ought to be voluntary for everyone involved. So, that includes the person who's committed harm, it includes anyone who's been harmed by that, and any other people who may wish to be involved in such a process, including representatives from the community. And this really, one of the key things, if you think about the principles, is that because this is about taking responsibility for your obligations, that's why it's important it must be voluntary. Because if someone is compelled to do something, then it doesn't provide an opportunity for them to take responsibility themselves, but rather they're being forced to. Safety is another key concern. So restorative justice ought not to go ahead if it's going to be unsafe, if it's likely to cause further harm, if it's likely to re-victimize people in the process. And I've also been involved in research on assessing and mitigating risk in restorative justice, which was led by Professor Joanna Shapland. And one of the things we saw there is that how the way that practitioners tend to assess and mitigate risk is very much tailored to the specific circumstances, understanding what do people need and then how can these be met in a safe way. So they are very much kind of like bespoke processes related to what's actually needed and appropriate in a given situation. But certainly safety becomes key, and it includes that if, say, in the moment when you're actually within a restorative justice meeting, that things look like they might become unsafe, then using approaches such as pausing meetings, taking people out of rooms and so on to ensure that safety can be protected. Restorative justice ought to be inclusive, and this includes both thinking about specific processes. So if you're involving people in a restorative justice process, that they are able to fully take part. This includes things like, accessibility. Can people access locations where they're taking place? And things such as like language. For example, do people have the ability to speak, relatively fluently in the main language that the process is going to take place? Do people need interpreters and so on? So there can be a range of things. Also, more generally, restorative justice ought to be inclusive in terms of thinking about, all members of society ought to be able to take part in this if they so wish. Some other research I've done in this field has looked at the involvement of asylum seekers and refugees in restorative justice processes in the United Kingdom. And one of the things was noted there is that actually it seems that very few end up taking part in these processes, which raises questions about, how accessible are restorative justice services to all members of communities. Fundamentally, restorative justice needs to be underpinned by dignity and respect. And I see that there's kind of two parts to this. It's both in terms of the process itself and in terms of the outcome. So the way that people engage with each other ought to be in ways that demonstrate and respect people and their dignity. And also that actually one of the key things that has been restored when we talk about restorative justice, and a question might be, what is restored by restorative justice? And I would say that dignity and respect are actually key things that are being restored by that process. That when people are harmed by criminal harm, then fundamentally one of the things that is being harmed is their dignity and respect. And so by creating a process that allows people to be involved in that way is a way to re-establish respectful relationships and restore people's dignity. As mentioned, a key part of this is responsibility and accountability, so providing opportunities for people to take responsibility for any harm that they have caused. But also, more broadly, it's about thinking, well, who else needs to take responsibility for the situation? So we might be thinking about, well, what are the factors that might have created conditions that led to someone harming someone else? What about what's going on in a society, a community, or a neighborhood? Are there things that could be protective? Are there ways in which people might have been failed that ought to be addressed? And so this allows a kind of a broader perspective as well around the criminal harm to think about those communities and other people who can take some responsibility, both in terms of trying to prevent, say, further offending, but also, of course, for people who have been harmed in the process as well, how can they be assisted to recover? truth-telling and honesty needs to be at the core of this process as well. So if it fundamentally, it needs to be a process where people are able to be honest and truthful about what has happened and enable those true stories to be told. And I think this links back as well to this idea of voluntariness. If this is a situation where people are coerced into it, then it may reduce the likelihood and ability for people to be honest in those processes. So that's why actually that value of voluntariness is fundamental, really, to being able to facilitate a process that can generate truth-telling and honesty. So those are some of the core principles and values. What I want to talk about now for a bit is what are some of the kind of the processes, what actually goes on in restorative justice processes. And fundamentally, the focus ought to be on moral repair. What do I mean by moral repair? Well, if you think about harm, criminal harm, it's not just something that occurs in a kind of a physical sense, but there is a moral dimension. And that's really where restorative justice kind of comes in as a way to address those moral dimensions, to understand not just that it was harm, but that it was a wrong. And so how can we consider what are the wrongs that have occurred here as well, and how can we enable processes that allow people to try and set them right? And so a key part of this as well is understanding, well, what might someone need to help address the harm that has been caused. And that's why the voice of the people who have been harmed is critical to the process to understand what they might need. And this sometimes just includes simply information and understanding of what happened. Sometimes they're really looking for some kind of apology. Sometimes people are looking for something that's more tangible in terms of reparation. Maybe they're looking for some kind of financial reparation. Maybe they're looking for something more symbolic that the person can do. And this includes some very creative types of work which can take place. Some of you might know in Shetland there is Space to Face, a service that provides restorative justice, but one of the things that quite often they include in those processes are more creative and artistic processes whereby someone might actually create some kind of like product to try and demonstrate how they can set things right and convey things that in ways that might be more difficult simply through words, let's say. In terms of the actual process, I would say that it typically involves facilitating dialogue and deliberation. And I think it's actually helpful to distinguish between dialogue and deliberation. I'd say it's often not actually that clear when we talk about restorative justice what the processes are. And I think there can be quite significant differences here. I've got the image there of a glass of ice with water in it to think about that. What we could be thinking about is a kind of a same substance in different forms. So dialogue, to me, is essentially that process of communication that's primarily aimed at increasing mutual understanding. It's about having honest and open discussions where people are there to try and hear each other and to learn from each other to gain a better understanding. So in particular, things like to gain a better understanding as to why a particular harm took place, why someone was targeted, for example. To be able to communicate what the extent of the harm was, what the consequences were, and for someone to be able to hear and understand that. So that's all about generating understanding, and that can really only happen if there is a situation which enables that kind of openness to learning. And so those kinds of barriers and defensiveness need to be reduced. So that's what I would call dialogue. Deliberation is more about making decisions. So about discussing things to come to conclusions about what ought to be done next. So for example, making decisions about, okay, if someone is going to offer some kind of reparation, whether that's symbolic or material, what are they going to do? What are they going to provide? And some restorative justice services, for example, have a focus on outcome agreements. So this is where people actually decide and write down precisely what they will do. And it includes, of course, things that might be around actually addressing people's needs. It might be for someone who's been involved in offending behaviour, that it might be around addressing other things that are going on in their life. Maybe it's about trying to address things such as their drug use, or perhaps trying to engage in education or employment. So there could be a range of of things that could be related there. One of the things that can happen in cases, quite often I would say, of quite severe harm, could be that people are worried about what might happen if they see each other in the street, or let's say someone has been in prison, is getting released, what that might look like. And so even being able to talk about and agree how to manage that can be extremely important for people. So where they might agree that, for example, if they see each other in the street, they could, for example, just say hi and that's it. Or they might decide that if you see each other in the street, we just ignore each other and move on, or whatever. But the agreement is up for them to come to, but it's a way of managing something that could actually create quite a significant amount of anxiety. And different restorative justice processes probably put more or less emphasis, I would say, on dialogue or deliberation. Some of them may be focused more on trying to, for example, resolve a case outside of court, and maybe more focused on the kind of deliberation side of it in terms of how do we actually deal with this. And some might be more focused on dialogue, which is really about trying to increase mutual understanding to answer questions and so on. Restorative justice can also, I think, help to enable a range of other types of outcomes. So, for example, I've talked about reparation already. We can think about rehabilitation, desistance from crime, and recovery. These things it's unlikely to achieve in and of itself, such as just through a meeting, but can enable them in other ways. So it might be, like as we've talked about, that it may be discussing and agreeing what might be done to try and address some of the issues in someone's life. It could be about trying to support someone in that process of desistance from crime. One of the things we know about that is that people's social context and connectedness with other people is really critical to that. So it may be that even sometimes it happens that a person who has been harmed offers to provide something that might assist the person who's created that harm, or it might be about through involvement of other members of the community or family members and so on. There can be others who can support people with that process of trying to move away from offending behaviour. And it can also potentially assist recovery. Some of this can be enabled partly through the process itself, actually just through having questions answered, or as we talked about, dealing with, for example, anxiety or what to do if you encounter someone on the street. But it could also be about identifying, well, what does someone need to recover from the harm? And is there a way to tap into resources that could help them in that process? So I really see that restorative justice kind of fits in that point of helping to enable other types of outcomes that could come later in a way. Shame is a major issue in relation to harm, and restorative justice in many ways provides one way of actually trying to respond to that. As many of you will know, shame can affect people in a range of different ways, and it can include, for example, someone who's been harmed blaming themselves and feeling quite shameful about what happened. It can also include people who've committed harm feeling very ashamed about what they've done. And as well, there can be shame amongst, family members and friends and so on. And this, of course, can create a barrier to restorative justice itself, but also to other kind of processes of change. If shame essentially becomes a kind of a barrier or a defense mechanism, sometimes that can lead to people kind of attacking themselves, but also can lead to people attacking other people as well. One of the things that restorative justice can do is, for example, if someone is feeling high levels of shame and blame towards themselves, if they have actually been the person who's been harmed, the restorative justice process can allow the responsibility to put where it ought to be, which is with the person who's actually committed the harm. So someone who has been harmed coming into a restorative justice meeting might be able to, hear the other person take responsibility for what they've done, locate the responsibility in the correct place, and that may help them to alleviate feelings of shame and self-blame. And also, one of the ways of conceiving of restorative justice and the way that kind of operates and brings benefits to people is through reintegrative shaming. And this is the idea, there's several aspects to this, but one is that it is about understanding that the harm that was committed was wrong, but that doesn't mean that the person themselves is bad, that they have the potential to change. And so by focusing on the harm, and by enabling someone to take responsibility for that, one of the things they're able to do there is to signal to themselves and to other people that they understand the moral nature of the harm that they've committed, and indeed can demonstrate to other people that actually they are someone who can do right, because simply by engaging in a restorative justice process, but also by taking responsibility to try and set things right, and particularly following through from this. So this is a way to manage shame in a way by and some would describe this as taking shame and turning it into a form of guilt, specific responsibility for particular actions, and then this enables one to move forward. Trauma-informed practice is becoming more and more recognised, certainly in Scotland, in the criminal justice kind of context, and also I think services more widely. And restorative justice kind of practices are recognised for some time now that being trauma-informed is really important. What does this mean? Well, in one sense, it means understanding that where someone has been affected by criminal harm, that could have been severely traumatizing for them, and recognizing and understanding how that might affect their ability to engage in the process and what they might need. For example, some practices involve where the harm has been particularly traumatizing, that someone might not want to essentially go over it in any detail. And so a practitioner meeting with them may then decide or discuss with them that they're not actually going to revisit it. They're not going to go through what actually happened, but rather they're going to focus on what the person needs and look towards the future. And restorative justice is very, very much future orientated, as well as looking about at taking responsibility for their actions. So that's just one way in which it could be trauma informed. Of course, what we know is that people involved in the criminal justice system have very often experienced trauma in a range of ways themselves. So this isn't just about a person who may have been harmed, but also person responsible for the harm, about understanding about the trauma and experiences that they may have had, and what that might mean for how they engage, how they need to be supported to engage in a process. And just finally, context is really important. So restorative justice takes place in many parts of the world, but it often looks different, sometimes very different. And it's important to recognize that. Restorative justice often is grown out of kind of grassroots movements, which means it's very much grounded in local communities and connects with like cultural practices and so on. So it means that restorative justice, as it looks in, let's say, Scotland, might look very different from how it looks in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And also not only because of the kind of the cultural context, but also the kind of the criminal justice context as well. How is it envisaged and practiced in interfacing with the criminal justice process itself? So in some cases, it is directly linked to other criminal justice processes, such as it might be diversion from prosecution, or it might be referred to from the courts. And that's going to look quite different than if it is a voluntary process that it takes place either completely outside of any criminal justice processes, or it operates in parallel to them. Some of the other things include so some of the cultural dimensions might be things like, where does it take place? Does it take place on some kind of traditional meeting place? Does it involve food? Does it involve prayers? Does it involve singing? And these can be extremely important, in particular contexts and for people of particular backgrounds. And so understanding that is going to influence how it's done, who's involved. And so that's also one of the reasons why what we tend to see is when we look at restorative justice and try and make large claims about how it operates or its effectiveness, for example, it's difficult because actually we're talking about slightly different things. I think fundamentally those things that I've talked about already around the key kind of values and principles and the core practices tend to remain the same, but there can still be important differences about how it's delivered on the ground. And that's all I have to say right now. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions.
That was excellent. It always strikes me how well you can skillfully bring that experience of practice and literature and theory all together in one place. And yeah, really enjoyed your run through it. Particularly like the glass of water analogy, thinking about dialogue and deliberation as well. So you might find that one popping up somewhere else. So yes, over to yourselves. If anybody's got any question, please pop it in the chat. And we're happy to ask on your behalf, Steve. Whilst we've got them for another, I think, 15 to 20 minutes. So let's make the most of it. I would be really interested to know from yourself, Steve, where you would see the next steps for the practice framework. What we'd like to see happening since you've put all that hard work into it. What would be the kind of next steps for it?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, essentially what I was trying to do is distill some of the things that I've kind of observed and learned over the years. I mean, much of what I do, to be honest, is kind of learning from practitioners and other pieces of research and trying to reflect things back and find out, does this make sense to you? Is this helpful? So, I mean, for me, like, I'd just be really interested to hear what people make of this, how useful it is, or, or not, if they see the areas actually it needs to be developed. So, yeah, at this stage, I'd just be really open to finding out about its kind of use and hearing reflections on it.
Yep, and I guess essentially something like this will help to spread the word of it. And as we said before, all the links to the paper will be sent out afterwards to everybody. Okay, thank you very much. So we've got a question from Claire. When she asks, when setting up new services to support RJ approaches in a social work setting, what advice would you offer?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few different things to consider. One of the things actually I've just realised we could direct people to is we've developed a toolkit on implementing restorative justice, so that's something else I could share too. And I guess a couple of key things come to mind. So one is obviously training. So people need to be trained in restorative justice and what it means, what it involves. Another thing is actually understanding how cases are going to come to the practice, if you like. So, is this about working with people who are, let's say, on community sentences? Are you getting referrals from somewhere else, and understanding how that's going to work? There's also quite a few logistical things, particularly if you're located in a criminal justice kind of like context within social work, then you're likely to have access to information about the people who've committed the criminal harm, but you might not have access to the people who've actually been directly harmed. And so understanding about how that information comes to you, which includes all sorts of boring technical things around data protection, but which are actually quite important, and understanding, how you would actually make the offer to people who've been harmed is really critical. So those kinds of data sharing and data protection processes are really important. There's quite a number of other things that would have to be considered, but I think those are some of the fundamental ones when you're starting to think about how you could actually start delivering restorative justice.
Yeah, thank you very much. And absolutely, the toolkit we'll make sure it's sent out as well. It's about, was it 2020, 21 it was published, but it's still very up to date and relevant. So absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question, and maybe one you might want to dodge due to some of the discussions we've already had in Scotland round about it. But it's been asked, do you think that RJ can take place within cases where there are domestic offences?
I think potentially, but I think that the use of restorative justice in relation to domestic abuse is probably the most challenging one. And, I would refer back to that value around safety. I think that's absolutely critical here. So a key thing would be to understand, is it safe to go ahead in this context? If coercive control is going on, for example, then it's almost certainly not going to be appropriate, because if people are being coerced in any way, then it's not possible to actually have voluntary engagement in restorative justice. One of the things that could be considered is actually, are we talking like when at the point where harm is very recent, or imminent, or are we talking about something that may have happened years in the past where there might be potential to do something? But I think fundamentally it would be about understanding, the potential for genuine voluntary engagement, safety, and whether that can be effectively managed.
Thank you. And within Scotland, there's a practice and policy framework, I think it's been called, that has been through several drafts just now, which should sort of tease out where Scotland's position is with domestic violence and domestic abuse as well. So that should hopefully answer the question for you, Neil. Okay, I've got another wee question in from Carolyn. What is your view on using this framework within an organisation in relation to complaints about staff, both upheld and not upheld, and using it to restore staff and organisation relationships?
Yeah. So, this particular framework has been developed for the use in relation to criminal harm. I guess I would just say it's not intended for that purpose as such. But if you're thinking more broadly in terms of the use of restorative practices in relation to the kinds of complaints about staff that you mentioned there, then I think absolutely, because you're fundamentally able to use a process that is about increasing understanding, about people taking responsibility and being future orientated in terms of trying to set things right. So it's likely that you can use processes like that could actually be quite productive in terms of trying to address issues, and ideally that people might get a more kind of satisfactory experience at the end of that, both people who have lodged complaints and the people who it's affecting. But I have to say it's not an area of my expertise, but certainly I believe there is potential to use those processes in that context.
Yeah. Thank you. And there may be something more specific out there. If it's something that we can come across, we'll certainly share it with you as well. Thank you. Okay, so the questions are coming flying in now, Steve. So I've got one here that says, do you have any tips on communicating messages about meeting needs of the people responsible and understanding how their own personal experiences have contributed to their harming? So they're thinking about how to most effectively communicate with the victim survivor advocacy services, who can be uncomfortable with that lens and feel we are excusing the harm or detracting them from the victimhood of the person harmed. Relatively long question.
Yeah, that's a big one. A really, really interesting one. I guess maybe here's one thing to think about, is that from the perspective of restorative justice, we're not talking about victims and offenders. We're talking about specific harms and how they're responded to. So when you think about it in that way, you're not categorizing people. You're actually talking about specific actions, and that means that one day someone may have been harmed, and then the next day they may have harmed someone else. And so actually when it comes to thinking about services to support people who have been harmed, they also, some of them may have committed harm. So then you're able to actually think more broadly about what are someone's needs, and just start to think about, okay, so they may have been harmed in these ways, and this may have affected them, and created these kinds of needs and a responsibility to address that, as well as the fact that they may have harmed other people as well. So how can we actually kind of take all of this into account? And I think that's why restorative justice as an approach can be more productive in that sense, because it doesn't try to just categorize people as one thing or another, but to try and actually kind of cut through that to understand the different obligations that are created by people's actions, both where this might be things that someone has done to someone else and that others have done to them. And so in terms of, for example, services that are supporting people on the basis that they have been victims of harm, that if they were also to think about the extent to which some of the people they might be supporting have committed harm, maybe that opens up a kind of a lens for thinking about this in kind of different dimensions, if you like.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Laura, and start thinking about that. So I've got a question here from Andy, and it's specifically around about cases of murder. Can restorative justice be utilised in cases of murder where the person harmed is now deceased, i.e. the perpetrator of harm engaging with the family of the person harmed?
Yeah, it certainly can, and it certainly has been done, including in Scotland. And so, just to give, like, some of these examples have been kind of widely publicized, but they might include something, for example, where two people are driving a car, let's say two friends, and one of them, is speeding, crashes the car and kills their passenger. And so in this case, what you've got is a circumstance where, one person is obviously being killed, someone else is going to prison, but those people had a relationship and their families are likely to have relationships as well. The harm is really significant, very difficult to deal with, particularly for the criminal courts, who have a very blunt instrument that they might use, for example, imprisonment, which doesn't really do anything in terms of addressing those relationships that have been harmed. And so in that case, restorative justice processes offer the ability to actually facilitate some kind of, dialogue, to generate understanding and try and address some of those relationships, allow people to deal with, for example, talked about shame, which might be quite high in that kind of context, how you can address that, but also those ruptures in relationships, which might also be very, very complicated. Something I haven't really talked about today, but is that for some people, they can have very strong feelings of violent revenge, which can be very real. And so this, has the potential for further harmful repercussions if they're not addressed as well. And so, fundamentally, one of the things restorative justice is about peace building. And so in that kind of context, there can be ways to help people get answers to kind of rebuild relationships if they want to, or just try and find ways to live, really, to move forward. So I believe that actually in that kind of context can be really valuable. And one of the other things I'd just say more generally is that research has found that the more severe the harm, the more benefits that people have. So in fact, actually, while it might seem slightly counterintuitive, but actually in cases that are very severe, such as homicide, that's the restorative justice actually has the most potential to deliver benefits for people.
Thank you. And I probably just want to add there are cases across Scotland where it's been used and used quite successfully as well. So I would agree with what Steve's saying there in terms of building relationships that maybe pre-existed, but also supporting if it's a small community to be able to bring them back together, live in close proximity. Absolutely. So I've got a question here from Dominique. When you talked about experiences of shame, does this framework explore supporting people who experience shame to the detriment of the process and potentially creating risk around the person causing the harm? Thinking in context of youth justice and how fragile the psyche can be developmentally at the stage of development.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think you do have to be wary of this. I think this comes back, I guess, to that notion of safety. And so that, for example, if you've got, like you say, a young person and thinking about developmental stages, that having someone then have to enter a process and be in a place where they're taking responsibility for their actions, where there's high levels of shame, that could be very, very tricky. I think. And this is where one of the things I didn't really talk about is restorative justice involves a significant amount of preparation before, you might have a meeting. And so one of the things that would need to be kind of assessed and engaged with is people's feelings of shame and how they feel about themselves and their ability to enter a kind of a space like that. Because as I said, if we talk about like reintegrative shaming, that's that idea that actually by someone taking individual, responsibility for their actions, other people around them, people that they care about, are able to reflect back to them the positive steps that someone's take to be able to communicate to them, you did a bad thing, but you're not a bad person. You're taking steps now to recognize what you've done and try and do something positive and move forward. So it can actually be a very powerful mechanism for addressing those feelings of shame. But I guess you would have to be to essentially assess and be aware that those feelings of shame weren't such that it didn't become a barrier to them engaging, or could actually have a negative effect if they weren't managed well, particularly in the encounter itself.
I think that comes back to the process and its voluntary nature and being individualised that would be required in order to move forward. Some of these cases coming from the kind of youth justice arena, it's really important that a kind of robust risk assessment for any child being involved in it would take place in order to address some of that. Absolutely. So I've got a couple of questions here that are potentially a bit more practice related. Well, I'll ask them anyway. And I've got one from Angela. Is restorative justice implemented in the Scottish law processes for juveniles and adults? Is victim offender mediation on offer from the court, and in which stage? Not sure whether you want to answer that, Steve.
I'll perhaps give a more general response here, which is that it's possible. And it is done in different parts of the country. It's more well established in the kind of the youth sector, and so it can often be used there in relation to young people. In terms of the courts, it's very rare for it actually to be used at this point in time, or indeed, to my knowledge, in recent years, interfacing with the court itself. It has been done on a handful of occasions, to my knowledge, including where a judge has deferred sentence to allow a restorative justice process to take place. So essentially it can, but it's not well established. And so, for example, for a victim of a crime to request it, for example, it might not be something that a court is able to facilitate, simply because they don't have a setup which would allow them to do that. But to my knowledge, the kind of the legal system and infrastructure permits it, even though it doesn't, specifically say this is a thing that you can do.
And there's a piece of research that was done quite recently, which kind of pulls together some of what is happening currently in Scotland. So again, we'll ensure that we share that. I suppose the picture across it is that it's quite patchy, and there's pockets of good work happening, but it wouldn't be suitable for a live case going through the court system. It would be either as a stage prior to that or a stage after that, in terms of the like through following a custodial sentence, for example. Okay, I've got another wee question here from Libby. Again, quite practice focused, asking, is there something that the PF or police could consider at reporting stage of offence to allow the PF to consider other community disposals rather than diversion, in light of the volume of cases now being diverted to from prosecution? So I take that there's been an increase in the number of cases coming through diversion, so wondering whether there would be a kind of opportunity to use restorative justice as part of that.
So my understanding is that the police can use restorative warnings, so they can essentially use restorative type responses at that point without it actually having to, go to the Procurator Fiscal. It has been used as diversion from prosecution, but to my knowledge, it's not currently used in that way. There was a period from around in fact, it stretched back quite a long time, but up until a few years ago, in some parts of the country, it was being used in diversion and prosecution. Indeed, I was a volunteer restorative justice facilitator for the Edinburgh service for a while. So it did allow basically for a Procurator Fiscal to essentially refer a case to a restorative justice service where they could have a restorative justice process. And then if that was essentially resolved, then the case wouldn't proceed to court. So there are possibilities for this, but Pamela, you mentioned that there's some work at the moment going on and kind of working through the policies and procedures at the moment to kind of work through all of this. So I'm not sure of the exact detail at the moment. I don't know, Pamela, if you had any.
Yeah, I think the concern with it used as an alternative would be around the voluntary nature of restorative justice, and it's it's something that I've been kind of grappling with for some time to ensure that it's really embedded, but there's still an option to take part, because as we know, if diversion isn't suitable, it's the potential to go through court. So if they're choosing not to take part because it's a restorative element, where does that leave them? So that essentially will be kind of addressed in the policy and practice framework as well, which is a Scottish Government led document, which they're with at the moment. Okay, so I've got one more little question, and I think it will be probably the last question just due to the time that we've got. And again, quite practice focused. So is there anything more you can say around about the system successes of overcoming data protection to offer process to people harmed? And I believe this is coming from an organisation who are keen to provide restorative justice, but obviously have the issues of the information sharing that you had highlighted in a previous answer.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm probably not the person to ask, because it's quite a technical question over, how you actually have those processes. I mean, my main kind of understanding is that it's a challenge, and part of this came out of the GDPR, and that you couldn't just share, for example, the details of victims with other services. There had to be legal grounds for doing so. So my understanding is then you actually have to have, a clear legal basis in which to share data, or informed voluntary consent to share that. So that's kind of the limits of my knowledge of the kind of the detail of how that would operate. I don't know, again, Pamela, if there's other people who are currently working through this.
Yeah, again, I suppose across Scotland where we see it working well is with those local relationships with police colleagues, local authorities, and be able to kind of work together. If there's an area, there's some areas across Scotland where it's working well because they've got those kind of local relationships rather than it being a national decision for organisations to share that data between each other. So I suppose at the moment that would be the kind of biggest piece of advice round about being able to overcome some of that. Okay, so I think we're just coming to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Steve Kirkwood. It's been really, the questions were flying in the other end. It's been really good to hear about your the framework and I guess just making people more aware of it so that it can start being used and move forward with some of this work. Also, thank you for everybody for attending. We will send out all the links mentioned, plus probably some more, just to sort of fill your not brains and worlds of RG, to kind of get the conversation continued. But for the moment, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.